Yeah, I know. It's hard.
Welcome, everyone. We're going to get started. So we have maximum time for our brown bag today. Before I introduce Sigal Ben Porath, I have a couple of announcements I have to make. Those of you who are joining us on GoToMeeting, if you could please mute your sound and video. And if you are on GoToMeeting, if you have questions, ask them via chat, the GoToMeeting chat function addressed to the organizer. Okay, so end of announcements. I am very, very pleased to be able to introduce our speaker, Dr. Sigal Ben Porath, who's with us today. She's a political philosopher from the University of Pennsylvania, the Graduate School of Education there. And she's also an associate member of the Political Science and Philosophy departments at Penn. And Dr. Ben Porath's research focuses on citizenship education, normative aspects of educational and social policy, and the social and educational effects of war. Her areas of expertise include philosophy of education and political philosophy, and she's written widely and deeply on issues of citizenship, democratic education, and choice. Her first book, Citizenship Under Fire, Democratic Education in Times of Conflict, examines the relationship among civic education, the culture of war, and the quest for peace. Subsequent books critically examine notions of choice that are so treasured in democratic discourse and the civic implications of deep shifts in the sovereignty of nation states. But today, she's here to speak with us about her most recent book, Free Speech on Campus, published just a few months ago by University of Pennsylvania Press. And this topic's just a little bit timely, don't you think? I was talking with Sigal earlier, and she was telling me that this is her 17th talk this semester on the book. And she has,
and not the last one.
And not the last. You have one tomorrow, maybe, right? And next semester and next fall. And she's really traveling all over the country and the world talking about this work. So I'm very grateful that she was able to come here and speak with us about it. It's really right on the cusp of so many important issues that we're facing right now at the university and beyond. I just picked one little quote, which I thought was really useful from some of the materials from the book. Princeton philosopher Peter Singer wrote, "Free speech on campus makes a valuable contribution to a debate that's often been marred by confusion. Students, activists, professors, and university administrators can all learn from reading this book." And I know we're going to all learn from listening to Sigal today and discussing with her. She is an amazing, she has an amazing ability to clarify confusion. So thank you so much for joining us. And
thank you, Beth, and thank you all for coming and for having me here. It's, you know, I know it's called a brown bag. I don't think it's a brown bag when you get served lunch. So do you want
you can say hi. And
yes, I want to say hi to the GoToMeeting people who are joining us through this camera, but I think now we're going to switch to seeing my slides rather than my hair. Right, so there.
hi, everyone.
Okay, great. So, so I appreciate the way you set me up to clarify confusion, that because usually when I teach, I tell my students that my goal for them when they come to class is that they leave with more questions than they came in with. But I think what I'm going to try to do here is to give you a sense of some of the answers that I developed to questions that occurred to me as a philosopher, as an education professor, but also as part of my role in chairing Penn's Committee on Open Expression for the last 2 and some years. So this was just an administrative task that I was asked to do, like we chair all sort of committees or departments and schools, etc., as faculty. And I wasn't particularly starting this work being interested in the conceptual, historical, political, normative, etc. Dimensions of this work. I was mostly just trying to resolve the endless stream of cases that would show up on my step or in my inbox or in the middle of the night on, you know, on my phone. So as I was working through some of these cases, and as I was looking to and with some colleagues who are doing this work in other universities, it became clear to me that this is actually an issue that requires more attention than it's getting in terms of how we think about it and how we approach it, right? And then as a result, of course, how we address actual cases that are coming our way. So do I have to use the clicker to make the thing go? Let's see. No. Okay. So I hope that I don't need to convince you, and I know this particular university has had some issues in this area of free speech. These are all pictures from the last year, different campuses. I didn't have time this morning. I was hoping to add the picture from last night from the University of Connecticut, where a speaker from Gateway Pundit, which is a right-wing media outfit, gave a talk titled "It's Okay to Be White," which is a title that was taken from a Fortune, if you're familiar with Fortune, right, from an online discussion or meeting space where they were circulating this particular title, "It's Okay to Be White," as a way to try and instigate some of the conversations that are occurring on campuses today. And so he gave this talk that was some of the, right-wing ideological perspectives that have been circulating around campuses in the last year or so. And there was a protest and some scuffle, and he ended up beating one of the young women who was protesting his talk. From what I understood, again, I was just reading it really quickly this morning. And so, but this is one picture you don't get here. I'll end it next. But you have a protest against the ACLU, declaring it as a white supremacist organization. You have a protest at the University of Michigan against Charles Murray. You didn't read about this one in the papers, so you read about Middlebury maybe, but this is the same speaker later on. And then we have a faculty who are protesting some events in Missouri. So there are a lot of cases going around the country these days. And I think for the most part, the way that we perceive them is misguided. So a lot of people, if we look at the polarized views that are represented in the media right now in discussing these matters, we have a lot of right-wing talk declaring you all, or maybe all of us, or everybody who's on campus as a snowflake, or as somebody who is unwilling to hear diversity of opinions, somebody who gets hurt too easily, who is protesting anything that's outside a very, very narrow ideological perspective, campuses as liberal bastions or as places where people come to be brainwashed with left-wing ideology, etc. I'm sure you all heard some of that. On the other hand, a lot of people on the left are concerned with trolls or with people coming to provoke with their, with their ideological perspectives, or with their sometimes prepackaged views, as I feel like the "Okay to Be White" title represents, right? I think it's okay to be anything, right? I mean, so I'm not complaining about this, but about the effort to instigate or to provoke. I think a lot of the work that we're actually doing on campus, all of this gets lost in the mix. And I think the way that today we are trying to resolve some of the issues that we have with free speech events gets framed and gets therefore addressed or resolved or analyzed or considered through the lens of extreme events and through the lens of some of these kind of one-sided frameworks. And I think that's unfortunate. And what I'm going to try to convince you is that actually what campuses do for the most part, right here in the middle, is protect free speech and live the daily life of encountering diverse opinions, considering evidence on a variety of sides, looking at controversial and unpopular opinions as just the mundane and daily life of what happens on any college campus in the 4,000 institutions of higher education around this country and in other democratic countries similarly. And I want still to recognize that we do actually have on campus both this problem, although it's inappropriately titled here, and this problem, right? So we do have a problem with people who are coming to provoke and not actually contribute to the discussion we are having on campus. And we do have this is more an issue with public universities than in private universities, but it's still an issue overall for the higher education sector. We do have a problem with what people deride as snowflakes. So I do think that we sometimes have a problem with people who, both faculty and students, who are too quick to judge opinions as being beyond the pale, and especially people who are looking to censor opinions based on judging them as being beyond the pale, which is something I do think we need to work on campus. So that's part of my assumptions here, and I'm happy to discuss them. But we cannot have our entire conversation about campus speech or campus free speech be framed by the events on either of these sides. We have my call for you, right, is that we have to get ahead of the conversation and try to frame it ourselves rather than allow ourselves be framed by some views, some of the, okay, I was gonna say find people on both sides, but probably that's the wrong phrase to use. Okay, so my suggestion is that as we think about campus and the work that we do around speech here, we need to recognize and state that campuses are not just any regular part of the democratic public debate. Campuses rather are mission-driven institutions, and they should therefore have our own norms for dealing with speech. Okay, so obviously we need to abide by all the regular laws that exist in the country, including most centrally the Constitution and the First Amendment. I'm not trying to make any case here for exemptions from regular legal and constitutional order. However, I want to suggest that the work that the laws do for us, including the First Amendment, is insufficient for the kind of work that we're trying to do on campus, right? So the purpose that speech serves here is different and has further layers than the purpose that free speech serves in the general democratic public sphere, including the media, the free press. Generally speaking, because we are driven by mission and because our mission is based on some key principles that I'm going to elaborate on in a second, just a little bit, we need our own rules, and we actually do have our own rules, right? And these should be acknowledged and they should be celebrated, and we should insist on them. We shouldn't try to abide by general democratic norms. They don't work for us. They don't do for us the work that we're trying to do. Okay, so our mission, this is not news to you, so I'm just stating it, right? This is sort of common knowledge. Our mission is to search for knowledge, to search for the truth, right? I'm saying knowledge to include the truth within it, right? And to respect the variety of evidence-based and other forms of disciplinary practices that we have, to search for knowledge, to push the boundaries of knowledge, and to try and understand more about the world that we live in. That's always been, this is what higher education is for, right? It's a standing mission. but our mission is expanding, right, in the United States and also in some other countries, especially democratic, but not only countries. Our mission is expanding to include the expectation that we educate more students, that we educate different students, and that we educate them for further roles than we were initially expected to do when the higher education vision was established in this country and also in other countries prior to that. So if universities initially were meant to develop a leadership, especially religious leadership, political leadership, and in some contexts also financial leadership or economic leadership, right now, universities and colleges are, of course, meant to do a lot more than that. We're expected to prepare people for a wide variety of economic roles, and we're also expected to educate people for a variety of civic roles. And all of this is part of the current mission of higher education institutions, all of which factors into the way in which we should understand how speech plays out within the context of our campuses. And this is why, so this mission, all of these parts of our mission is the reason why the First Amendment and other legal practices, including norms, legal and regulatory norms that are newer and unique to the higher education context, are not going to do the work for us in managing and supporting and maintaining our commitment to free speech. So I just want to give you one example so that you have a sense of what does it mean that we have our own norms, right? So in the public sphere, you know, if I'm a politician or if I'm an employee in some other context that's not higher education, and Beth was creating some kind of files or data and something that we're supposed to share for the purpose of our marketing department in Verizon, where we work in this story. And then I go to our boss and I say, look, I prepared these files just as you requested, and I don't give Beth the credit she deserves. So she may be pissed, she may be angry and not talk to me or not share her work with me. There isn't consequences for me in the workplace environment, right? But at the university, if I plagiarize my work, there are professional consequences because we have different expectations around the way that we represent ourselves. Similar things happen, for example, with lying, which is, considered maybe, morally repugnant in some cases or inappropriate in various professional cases, but not necessarily, doesn't necessarily have consequences and definitely is part of protected speech. Whereas at the university context, more readily, this would be unprotected speech for the professional purpose, even if it's protected from a constitutional perspective. Okay, so basically the framework that I try to develop in order to address some of these matters is a framework that I call inclusive freedom. That's what I write about in the book. I was gonna say that the first slide you guys saw was the cover of my book, which I really like. I think is really pretty. So, so I'll go back to it when we do the Q&A. So I didn't make the cover, right? I'm just happy that the press did it this way. So inclusive freedom is basically a framework that should not be understood as a middle of the road between a commitment to inclusion and a commitment to free speech. It sounds like that a little bit, but it's actually not a middle of the road. It's trying to place or to create a new context that incorporates both, right? So it's not giving up a little bit here and giving up a little bit there and trying to find the middle ground. It's actually trying to get to create a context where we actually incorporate the insights from both of our commitments to free speech and to inclusion and diversity. Here is why and how we should do that. This approach is not focusing only on the legal dimensions of protecting free speech. As I said, it's actually or of penalizing people who are breaking the rules of free speech, who are silencing speakers, or who are obviously, as I don't know if you guys are familiar, but we now have efforts in a number of states to legislate that students in public universities who are participating in protests have to be expelled, right? So prohibiting student protest. This is a law that already passed in Wisconsin, and is being discussed in a number of other legislatures around the country. Very disconcerting in my view, undermining the notion of free speech. I can't imagine how it's constitutionally permissible in terms of the First Amendment, but these are new legislation. So we'll have to see about challenges. So the responses are not going to be legal. What we need to seek is not new laws. The laws are fine, and it's also not new regulations or guidelines or norms within the university, right? Neither of these are going to do the trick for us. I do think universities need, and not all universities have, any type of guidelines that codify their commitment to free speech, or what I would prefer, right, the commitment to this type of free speech that I'm going to talk about. So I think guidelines are important. I found that the guidelines at Penn, you know, some of them maybe need updating. They are from the 1970s, you know, they have different aspects that, you know, like people didn't know that as much about Twitter as we do now. But so the guidelines, you know, require some attention, but I think it's really important to have good guidelines. I don't think guidelines are going to do all the work that we need to do around speech. I think we need to be committed to addressing the matter of speech as an educational matter, as part of our commitment to educating students and preparing them for their social, you know, economic, civic, etc. roles. Right? And so basically when they come to campus and they face sometimes contexts that are more diverse in a variety of ways than they have in their personal past, right? So maybe they meet people from further backgrounds, from more countries, maybe people from ideologies that they haven't seen before or really discussed much before. This is an opportunity for colleges and universities, and we need to embrace it, and we need to actively address it rather than try to let the students figure it out on their own and you know, punish them when they're not doing well enough. We have to recognize that when we defend free speech, as I suggest we have to do in order to protect the free inquiry, which is the core of our mission, or one part of the core of our mission, when we protect free speech, we are creating conditions of unequal burden for some people in our community more than others, right? So when we are permitting, as I think in most cases we should, and in some cases even when we shouldn't, especially in public universities, we have no choice, right? So we are permitting the kind of speech that can be and is harmful to some people on our campus. We have to recognize the unequal burden that we are creating for people from certain religious minorities or racial minorities or women or sexual minorities or other groups that by being exposed to certain types of speech are in fact being harmed. And why is this important? It's important obviously because we are committed to the well-being of all of our students. But it's also important because what matters for the purpose of our free inquiry is not just the nominal, legal, or formal permission that everybody participates in our conversation, right? You know, you have access, you're seated by the table, you're allowed to participate. What actually is more important for us is that people, in effect, substantively, are able to participate. So if I'm creating conditions that are silencing some people, right, from the examples I gave or others, when I'm silencing some people, my discussion itself becomes poorer. My effort to educate people is undermined. My free inquiry into the boundaries of knowledge and trying to push for a greater truth, etc. I'm limiting myself in my work when I'm not listening to what everybody around the table or everybody, you know, all members of campus have to say, right? So this is, you know, you all are in the ed school here, right, as I am. So you know that we should always pay attention not only to what somebody's teaching, but to what their students are learning, right? It's oftentimes a very different thing, right? And so we have to make sure not only that I can stand here and say whatever it is that I'm going to say, and that you all can answer and challenge me, etc., but actually that you can be listened to and heard and taken into account. And so this unequal burden is very important for us to counter it, but we have to counter it in the vast majority of cases without resorting to prohibiting the speech that we see as harmful. So we need to expand and protect speech, as I just now said, while creating an inclusive climate on campus, a climate that supports the inclusion of all members of our community in the free inquiry that we're engaged in. Good. So basically, to do that, this is my one philosophical slide, and then I have a couple of practical slides that I'm going to go through quickly, and that's going to be the end of my talk. So just to give you a preview here. So we need to be able to differentiate when we talk about safe spaces, right? And oftentimes students are calling for safe spaces, or universities are being challenged as, you know, resorting to creating safe spaces. The University of Chicago famously is adamantly opposed to safe spaces. I think this discussion is really poor, and it's misaligned with the actual request that the students are in effect making. Most, you know, for the most part, right, we have marginal cases, but for the most part, in my view, when students are looking or asking or demanding safe spaces, what they are talking about is dignitary safe spaces. In other words, they are looking for context where their dignity or their equal membership as part of the campus, as people who can contribute to the conversation, as people who are taken seriously as individuals, when their dignity is being put into question, or when they are repeatedly undermined as in their standing or in the perception of them as equal members of the campus community, this is the kind of safety that they are looking for. And it's the kind of safety that I think we should be committed to giving them, most especially in a residential context, right? When we have a residential campuses as opposed to commuter campuses, right? So in residential context, you have to have a place, you know, I don't know if you recall, but the one young woman at Yale who was very angry with her resident faculty member, and there was a whole exchange that was caught on video and circulating on social media, and she was, you know, I mean, she was very angry, so maybe she was, you know, not speaking entirely thoughtfully and choosing every word, but basically the perspective that she was really criticized for, I think, was a pretty reasonable perspective. She was saying, look, I live here. I need a place where I can feel at home, because that's where I live. It's my home right now. I don't want to always have to justify myself, in this case, as a member of a racial minority, but it's true in various other contexts, right? I don't want to continuously have to justify myself as belonging here, right? And I think in a residential context, it's not a ridiculous request at all. I think it's a pretty reasonable request. I also think it's a pretty reasonable request in the classroom context, right? If I'm saying, you know, I'll give you a glimpse into my life as a chair of the Committee on Open Expression. If I have a faculty member in a department or school where you have a tiny minority of the students who are women, and everybody else generally is male, and you have a professor who is also male and is always making really amusing comments about the women in the room, something about their looks and something about their hair and something about a mistake they made in the discussion, and is always noting how basically it's very cute that they allow women in our classrooms right now, but it's not necessarily a real contribution. This, I think, is an attack on dignitary safety that is fully protected speech, right? It's protected by academic freedom in the context of the classroom. It's protected, obviously, by First Amendment and other free speech statutes. But it's an inappropriate speech for a college context, and it's something that we need to deal with as chairs, sometimes as faculty people, colleagues, as students, etc. Right? So we need to look for ways to create dignitary safe environments in the classroom and in residential contexts, less so in other contexts, as I'm going to show in a second. But obviously, that doesn't mean that the University of Chicago's concerns about intellectual safety have too much to do with that. There are some cases where it's hard to know if the challenge is an intellectual challenge or is a dignitary challenge, right? So there could be cases, right, where the president of an Ivy League university is wondering whether women are a good fit for math and science. Maybe they don't have the right brain for that, right? So he's raising, you know, an intellectual, interesting and innovative, you know, concern, which can easily be interpreted as a dignitary challenge for, you know, all of these few women in his university who are actually in math and science. So, and the ones who may be thinking about it, etc. So the context really matters here. And sometimes it's hard to say whether it's intellectual or dignitary, but actually, usually it's pretty easy to say, right? Usually you can say, here is, you know, my history class, and we're reading Mein Kampf, okay? You know, basically making the argument for exterminating, you know, Jews, my family. So I think it's an important document to read, right? It's intellectual, you know, it's creating a lot of emotions and feelings, and it's hard to do. I think it's important, right? So there are places where you can say on the syllabus, it makes sense. If somebody's coming to make the case for it, doesn't make sense, okay? So we can interpret appropriately by the context, whether it's an intellectual matter or a dignitary matter. Again, obviously there are hard cases, but most cases actually are not very hard. Okay, so this is basically the end of my framing. I'm going to show you, this is going to be showing without telling too much, right? Because I'm running out of time. I'm going to show you that I have some thoughts about the practical application of some of this work into the various contexts on campus. I gave you some examples along the way, so I'll just give you a sense of where I'm going with that, and then I'll end. So basically, there are various ways in which we can create an inclusive and open classroom, starting with the syllabus, with our lesson planning, trying to identify where issues might come up in conversation in class, trying to anticipate them, creating explicit, spoken guidelines for how discussion in class is supposed to go, what is acceptable and unacceptable forms of disagreement in my class, right? I think it's true for any classroom. Some of the hard cases we had were in the hard sciences. I mean, you know, so it's true in any case. It's not just in a philosophy class or a history class. It's true for all different areas that we teach. And we have to be prepared for the limits of our lesson plans, right? Sometimes things are going to come up that you didn't anticipate. Anyone here who's a teacher, whether K-12 or college, they know that, right? Somebody's going to say something, it's going to be hurtful. And I have to prepare myself as an instructor to deal with that. And especially I have to remember that it's my responsibility standing up here to address cases where people are treating each other inappropriately in my classroom, right? It's my job. I can't move on, right? I can't keep clicking on my slides. I have to address it. And if I fail to address it, then I have to come back the next week and say, you know, something happened here and I didn't speak about it, but I'm going to speak about it now, right? So I have to see it as part of my job in class. Outside of class, it's a whole party, right? So, and sometimes more than just a party. So a lot of the events that we are seeing, this is Berkeley last year, a lot of the events we are seeing right now are happening outside of campus, especially with invited speakers and sometimes with uninvited speakers. And so I think it's important publicly to differentiate between cases where the events are university-based and ones where students are inviting the speakers or the speakers are inviting themselves. Again, as is mostly the case with public universities. We have to talk to students about appropriate modes of protest and activism. We have to have very broad acceptance, again, to the extent that, you know, in New Jersey, the legislature still allows that. So we have to push against some of these laws, in my view, as well. But we also have to talk to our students about the heckler's veto and why it's inappropriate in the university context, right? Again, other than very extreme and unusual cases, right, about other ways in which we can express our views or our disagreement with the speaker. We have to permit students to coalesce or organize in exclusive ways, but we also need to support students in developing their resilience and their diverse identities by going beyond only just coalitions and student groups or clubs that are identity-based, trying to create what more and more I think is important, both in the campus context and in the wider democratic context, trying to create imperfect coalitions, right? Trying to find ways where we are actually the same as a different group, and we, in some certain way, even if not in all ways, and trying to amplify our voice in response to things that are important to us, calling people in rather than calling them out for being impure in their ideological stance or in their views, in support of the broader goals that we can promote politically together. Okay, this was something I was going to brag about, but I'll skip that. In the interest of time, this is a very controversial event that we had on campus, and you guys haven't read about in the paper again, so I'm really excited about that. An event with a speaker who was created very strong emotions, rightly so, on campus, and we had excellent response from students who made their voice heard loud and clear about their disagreement with her views in opposition to the Black Lives Matter movement, while she still came in and gave a talk to the small group of students from the Federalist Society who invited her to speak. So, and you know, I'm definitely not doing it here, but when I'm speaking to administrators, I have a whole boring, you know, slide with the appropriate way to RSVP for an event, like all sorts of, you know, how do you check IDs? Like, so there are things that we can do to make events like this happen in an inclusive and free way. Okay, so inclusive freedom on campus basically means that we're asking ourselves, how are we creating an inclusion that takes into account specifically who does the inclusion, who gets to be included, and how do we express ourselves when we are unhappy with the topics, the people, or the modes by which this inclusion and open environment happens. Our goal should always be that the dialogue on campus can continue. There isn't going to be one rule, one event, or one action that we can take that will fix the issue for us. This is an ongoing matter, and so we have to always figure out ways where everybody can participate in the ongoing dialogue. Thank you. Of course, I'm happy to answer any questions or hear your comments. I'm not sure I can adjudicate cases on the fly, but I have tried before. So yes.
So at Rutgers, there was actually something passed by the Board of Governors which created disruption and like dealt and sort of defined it in particular ways that then sort of eliminates student active. And another thing that I'm interested in is this idea of the dignitary needs, because there was a free speech resolution passed or almost passed by the GSA where political identity was trying to be defined as a minority viewpoint. And I understand the contextual kind of piece to it, but how would you respond when clearly we think that that's more of an intellectual and less of like an identity-based piece? I don't know if that makes sense. But.
It makes a lot of sense. Okay, so let me repeat the question as I was asked to do for the web thing. So you're asking two things, one about the decision about disruption and what it means to be disruptive, and the other one about okay, so help me distill that.
Yes. So, no, the other one was more about when political views get
right. Should conservative views or other ideological views be protected? Should people who hold these views be protected groups in the same way that we have other minorities being defined as protected groups? Okay, so the disruption thing. I'll say this, and I haven't read carefully, and I should have, but I haven't, so I'm sorry, the decision by the board here at Rutgers. I think we do need, as I said, we do need to have guidelines. And I think it is appropriate to have guidelines about protests and other forms of disruption that limit two things. So I think it's appropriate to limit the following two things. One is disruption to classroom conduct, right? So I don't think classrooms are appropriate places for active, loud protests. For example, as we've seen at Reed College, I don't think it's appropriate. Classroom is for learning, so it's a different environment, and you cannot stage a protest in class. Obviously, you can protest a professor or a syllabus. There are ways to do that, not in class. So I agree with limiting that. And I think that what some guidelines call mode and manner, right? So you have to be able to carry out the general regular life of the campus, including research and teaching, learning, even when there is a protest going on. Again, in the majority of cases, there are going to be end cases. I've seen it myself on Penn's campus, justified disruptions to the mode and manner, regulation. But in most cases, you cannot have each and every disagreement or protest disrupt the regular life of the campus or blocking buildings or things like that. So this, I think, is appropriate. I still think that all of these regulations have to start with the assumption that protesting anything, expressing disagreement and protest, including especially by student activists, but also others, is an appropriate, accepted, mainstream part of the protected speech on campus. So this is where you start. Protest is something that, we value in the American ethos, is part of our democratic forms of expression. We actually should invite it, Students come to campus, I think they can hold our feet to the fire in important ways, right? Oh, you said you appreciate equality. How about this case or this group? I think it's really important and valuable. It's sometimes difficult, but I think we should encourage that. So, so I think if you start with appreciating protest and then you figure out ways in which you support and sustain it, without discrimination to viewpoint, as part of the ongoing conversation on campus, I think that's really important to do, right? And you can say not in class or not this way, or you cannot, burn fires on campus. I mean, so there are ways that you can limit it that are acceptable. Now about the viewpoint diversity and protected groups based on ideology. So I want to say the following. I don't think people should be defined as protected groups based on their political or ideological leanings for a variety of reasons, including that people change their opinions regularly. So, you know, definitely when they are 18 or 19 or 20, and sometimes way, way later, right? So I don't think this is an appropriate a aspect of one's identity that demands protection. You know, it can so easily ossify, you know, like, oh, this is where I have to stand now in order to be protected, right? So I think it's unhealthy. However, I do want to say that many campuses do face various, sometimes subtle limitations on the expression of certain ideological views, right? And you see it in specific departments more than others. I can speak to my own university. At the School of Education, there is one ideological leaning. At the business school, there is a different ideological leaning. So, you know, so there are differences across campuses, there are differences across schools and departments, and I think it's something we do have to deal with. You know, when I have students who are staunch supporters of a certain policies, like let's say privatization policies that are not popular among the majority of my other students, right? It's an ideological difference that I don't think is beyond the pale. I think it's interesting, it's enriching, we should have it. But I think oftentimes we create conditions where the students who support the unpopular in my classroom, unpopular, they are pretty popular in other places. So the less popular positions, they are chilled, right? They are silenced. They are so I do think we need to find a way to support diversity of opinion, diversity of events happening on campus, valuable events, ones that are actually engaging and have something to contribute, not trolling, okay? We have to do that, and we have to do it thoughtfully without creating a new protected group. Ben.
First of all, thank you. This is wonderful.
Thank you.
So rather than ask you a question, I'd like to share an idea that this raises for me, and then see what you think about the idea.
Great.
So back to your slide that talks about the mission of the university. It struck me that as a historical matter, that description of the mission of the university is aspirational. Mm-hmm. But there's another mission that particularly elite universities, but I would argue American higher education, has always been involved in, has always had, which is the maintenance of privilege. You know, universities are colonial projects, both intellectually and financially. They, you know, train colonial workers right down the line. Right. I'm reading Martha Biondi's wonderful book, Black Revolution on Campus. And so, in a world where actually part of the historic mission of universities in their ordinary operations is to maintain and protect privilege, right, that is rooted in colonial traditions, is there a problematic with protecting those ordinary operations from protest, because those ordinary operations themselves are implicated in undermining these aspirational goals? And can I get to part two?
Please.
Okay. And so part two,
make it harder
to go. So I think I have a resolution to this problem, which is what I want to share with you. If you go to your slide where basically you propose a 2x2, which is you have risk and you have safety, you have intellectual, and you have
dignitary.
Right, dignitary. Yeah. I wonder if a way of understanding what's happening now is to add a third dimension, which is privilege, and to look at the ways in which some people's dignitary identity is dependent on a certain set of assumptions about their privilege that they see either as under threat, well, I would say primarily as under threat, and the threat looks different to different people depending on the way in which they relate or don't relate traditionally to the way in which universities accord privilege. Right? And traditionally, universities, let's talk about race because that's primarily what's driving this. Traditionally, universities are white spaces. Right. Right? And not just procedurally, they're white spaces in terms of the knowledge that they produce. Yeah. Right? Could it be, and then I'll stop talking because this is your show, not my show. could it be that what we are seeing is we are seeing reactions against either threats to the opportunity for new privilege for the first time that we can extract from universities by actually holding them to their aspirational missions, versus people who are saying, hey, wait, you're taking away this thing that has always given people like me privilege.
Right. So the question is, in short, about whether universities should be understood not as searching for knowledge, but as sustaining a colonial project, and then whether we can add privilege to this slide that I have up here as a way to address some of this concern. Obviously, I need to think about this more. It's not something that I can, you know, it's too thoughtful to respond to without thinking some more. I would say that for me, the part that I'm pretty sure that I'm sharing with you, Ben, is that the driving force for me in trying to reframe the matter, which is I'm doing, you know, definitely using different terms and also different disciplinary tools than you do, right, as a historian or as a philosopher. So what's motivating me is the sense that the students broadly, right, in media discussions, including left-wing media discussions, sometimes on campus and definitely in the public debate, are being dismissed, right, as oversensitive, as always complaining, everything hurts their little feelings, I think is inaccurate. There are some cases, right? But overall, they have a point, and their point is the point that you're making just now. Their point is that if you, as a higher education sector, would like to pretend that what you're trying to create is equality of opportunity, is respect for diversity, is support for the civic mission of a democratic society, if this is what you say you're doing, okay, let's see. And let me show you where you're not doing it, right? And now let's start a conversation about that. And I think that's the interesting part of the conversation, right? So maybe I need to, you know, as you said, either add another dimension or maybe make the discussion here about dignitary safety, you know, the second point here, more nuanced in order to incorporate some of these concerns about privilege, which I definitely share. I mean, I think a lot of this discussion is being driven by concerns about people who are being silenced, which is the same as a colonial project. I mean, you know, it parallels your concerns about the colonial project. And so I think if we are to expand our knowledge, look at the inclusion of women in higher education institutions. A pen, of course, can, you know, like pretend like we've been doing it forever, right? Decades before most elite university or selective universities were doing that, but it's a process that took many, many years to kind of complete. The inclusion of women, which is easier than what you're saying now, it's easier in this historical juncture than what you're talking about now. The inclusion of women wasn't only just meant as a way to say, okay, come share a little bit of the limelight or a little bit of the privilege. Maybe that's how it started. But once women were in, we had some more ideas about some other things that can be changed. Maybe the syllabus, maybe how we define knowledge, maybe that harassing people is not such a great idea. You know, like also, you know, we have more perspectives on this than maybe only just the basic idea of here you get access and you can get, you know, a degree and you can be successful in the same way that success was defined before. No, we have some, you know, we are creating gender equity. Okay, let's start the conversation here. That's not the end of it. And so you're saying we have to do it with other groups as well, which I fully agree with. How exactly to accommodate that within the framework, I need to think about more, but I appreciate the comment. Yeah.
This is, I think a lot about disability sort of trauma.
Yeah.
And my question is really about sort of like a trauma-informed classroom and how we include students who may be experiencing, mental distress or mental illness or trauma in the classroom. And I wonder sort of where the separation between intellectual and dignitary risks sort of butts with the ADA and
Right.
students accessing their intellectual spaces. And I wonder what, if any, responsibility instructors have, or if it's a possible disability accommodation for students to, have things like, content learning or, particular class sessions that may be, disruptive to their trauma, et cetera.
Right.
So when free speech sort of impedes on disability rights.
That's a great question. It's a question about disability rights, mental health, and trauma-informed education. It's a great question. I think a lot about disability rights in this context, and I think a lot about the mental health context. Not so much, I've done work with free service teachers on trauma-informed education. I haven't thought about the free speech context in these particular terms, but let me give you something that I've had in mind and see if it helps. Maybe 2 points. One is that I do think, well, it's not that I think, I do read the empirical data that we have about the rise in struggles with all sorts of mental health difficulties among young people today. And colleges everywhere are dealing with it. Penn is dealing with it this year in very, very difficult circumstances. But also over the last few years, we see it across many campuses. And this is something that we have to take into account, and I think it sometimes gets mixed into the conversation about harm and hate speech, right? So harm is defined more loosely or more generously or more broadly when people have, or some significant portion of the members of your campus have fewer, have more limited capacity to deal with harm because they are struggling with additional mental health needs, right? And, when you're asking what kind of responsibility we have to deal with that, all the responsibility, okay? So all of it. I think if currently we're in a situation where many people on our campus are going to be people who are young people and others who are struggling with mental health concerns, this has to be just a mainstream part of our conversation. And in the same way that the ADA does it, it's not just, okay, let me, put a little ramp here. No, I have to design my space in a way that accommodates people with disabilities. I gave the example of a wheelchair, but obviously this is about any type of a disability. So in terms of responsibility, that's easy for me. I don't see limits to that. I think the law requires that, and I also think that our fiduciaries, I don't like so much the loco parentis, framework, but I think in the context of people with disabilities, we have the responsibility that's similar to any institution that is public or benefiting from public funds, so it includes all universities to do that. I'll say one thing that may be related to what you said about trigger warnings. People make fun of trigger warnings like they are some kind of a, like I have to resign to some silly, practices in accommodation of the crazy demands of the kids these days or something. And this is, again, has been the expressed and the staunch position from most loudly the University of Chicago, but a lot of other places that align with that view, which I think is just decidedly wrong. It's just not informed by any understanding of what pedagogy is and what people are, to be honest, right? So what is wrong with me deciding as an instructor that in my classroom, before going back to the example of Mein Kampf or looking at even the book on Ben's table just now, or any other conversation that or video or whatever that is going to be difficult for somebody to watch. I was teaching a class in ethics, and I was showing a video from a group that opposes factory farming that is called Meet Your Meat. It's pretty gruesome, okay? So you don't have to be vegetarian to find it gruesome. Maybe you would be vegetarian afterwards. So what is wrong with me saying, look, it's really troubling. We're gonna see this, that, and the other thing. Okay, if you feel like you can, if you want to brace yourself, that's the opportunity. If you feel like you cannot tolerate it, you can step out, and I will tell you later what it is that you step out for 7 minutes, the length of the video, whatever. I mean, it's my pedagogical, it's my academic freedom, first of all. I don't think the president of my university can tell me whether I can use that or not as a pedagogical tool. But I also don't know what's wrong with that. Is the best pedagogical practice springing surprises on your students and seeing how they respond? Who does that? So I think the whole conversation about trigger warnings, like they are something inappropriate or ridiculous, it's just uninformed. And so I think this just is one tool that we can use to address some of the concerns that you're talking about. Is the one that overlaps with the free speech concerns. So I hope that's useful. Yeah.
So first of all, thank you. And I see this discussion very relevant to the Indian case as well. So I grew up in India, and just to give a background, in India from 2014, the ruling party is right-wing, and they have more than 90% of seats in the parliament. So it's super crazy. So what's happening in last 2-3 years is that a lot of academicians and all critiquing the policies they have, the governments are proposing, like they ban the beef and on religious reasons, a lot of things. So the whole debate is now turned like that. These people who are critiquing government are actually against the nation. So because they're against the government, they're against the nation. And they're trolled and ridiculed in real life as well as in social media, saying that these people are anti-nationalists. So how should campuses address this issue when they're turned against government as against nation? I don't know if this is in the USA or not.
Right. No, it's clearly, if it's not here, then it's coming, right? But it's definitely easily a part of the debate here. A question about free speech in India under the current government. I don't have a very satisfying answer to this one, other than having the historical, legal, other conversation about what it means to be patriotic, what it means to love your country, including in the context of looking to make it better than it is right now, in your view. Right? So people have diverse views about the appropriate direction that their own country, whether it's India, whether it's the US, whether it's Israel, in my case, different views about the direction the country should go as opposed to the direction it's currently going in its policies, right? So I think this is, I just yesterday had a conversation with a student about the Indian practice in India to change the some parts of the K-12 history books when there is a new election, right? So so this is something that also depresses your ability to think differently about what the country should be. And all that I can offer here is that to the extent that free speech is still protected and celebrated in India, people should speak up, and there's a price to pay for that. You pay a public price, a price on the internet for sure. Sometimes you pay a professional price, which is regrettable, right? But it's beyond what campuses can do to, other than the normal professional supports that we provide. And as I said, the context that we provide for the continued ongoing exchange of diverse opinions on campus as an illustration or an example for a democratic public sphere for how this can actually work and the benefits of it. So, yeah, Hindra.
Thank you so much. This is so helpful. So my question is pretty particular to a specific case that I'm aware of at Rutgers, but I'm curious.
Which I'm not going to adjudicate on the fly. Right.
No. So I'm curious about how it applies with your framework. So there was a student who was caught on photographed at a protest, and that photograph made it to Breitbart, and the student was targeted for months. And then it kind of went away, and then later the student won an award at Rutgers and ended up in Breitbart again. So I'm wondering, to what extent does the university have a responsibility to protect that student from trolls? I mean, just being targeted online.
There's a difference here between responsibility and capacity.
Right.
Right. So, I mean, this is a case for me where a student, you know, is obviously, you know, I don't know the details of this case at all, but it sounds like they are being unjustly targeted, maybe in a similar way as the question about India, right? So somebody has an opinion, reasonably acceptable opinion, and they are being targeted for that in inappropriate ways. You know, the university has very limited tools to address that. They can and oftentimes should, you know, I don't know in the case of a single student, because it's just going to place them in a more difficult spot if the university puts out, you know, a press release about the students and their support of them. You know, I don't know that it helps, right? But I do think that it's important for a university. Sometimes it's going to be your advisor, your chair, your dean, your president. I mean, it really depends on the specifics of the case to express support for somebody's rights, you know, a student or a faculty person or other, to express their views as part of the democratic debate. There was one other question, but I think I don't know if you want to close down or if we should take the one last question we have here. Go ahead.
So this is coming from the high school that I worked at last year, where these issues were really, really bad. A lot of the students who had sort of the right-wing ideology said that they felt that they didn't have a voice, and in response, a particular black student got up in front of the entire school and said, "You're expressing your beliefs makes me feel like I don't belong here." So my question is, how do we as an educator negotiate when there's a fundamental disagreement about whether it's an intellectual risk or a dignitary risk?
Right. So you're asking how to identify the difference between intellectual and dignitary, especially in a K-12 context. And I just want to say, I've studied the K-12 context. It's not in this book. It's a whole other matter. So kids in a K-12 context have significantly more limited free speech rights than they do once they come to college. And actually, in the last 30 or 40 years, the courts have more and more limited the political, religious, even a humorous expression of students, K-12 students, in a variety of ways, which I find to be regrettable, but that's a whole other story. How do you know if it's dignitary or intellectual? I think in this case, you cannot limit reasonably accepted political expression that is part of the mainstream debate around the country right now based on the harm that it creates, right? So I don't think you can tell people you cannot express your right-wing ideology because it hurts somebody. I think you need to remain neutral. So you can say no expression of political views, and some schools do that. But as long as you are permitting expression of political views, you cannot pick and choose. However, as I kept trying to indicate through the discussion about colleges, and it's even more true in K-12, this is where the conversation starts. It's not where it ends, right? So if some people therefore feel excluded, and we've had cases, you know, since the election, you know, some students who were born in the US and they are building walls against their Mexican peers in the school, or chanting things about walls to try and indicate that they don't like immigrants. I mean, you have a lot of cases like this where the effort is even quite explicitly targeting or expressing disdain for a particular group. I think a lot of this cannot legally be prohibited, right? But it means that the school requires, you know, the school environment requires a conversation about accommodation and inclusion and the importance of diversity, and the school needs to take a stand on this. You know, they're gonna get in trouble with the parents, but that's gonna happen either way, right? It's these parents or those parents, you have to take a stand. And I think you have to do it in class, and I think you have to do it also at the administrative level. It's true in schools as it is true in universities. Okay, thank you guys so much.